Hello. Today I'm going to be showing you how I did the drawing Make-A-Wish. I started off by loosely blocking in where I want the flowers. I'm not following a reference photo for the background. I'm just sort of making it up as I go. It's the image that I had in my mind was of a field of flowers with the girl standing in front of the flowers. So I've just blocked in loosely where I want all the flowers. And I'm just doing that in various purples and pinks. Here I'm just using a tan pencil to put where I want the dandelions. So the girl's going to be blowing dandelions into the wind, and the base of the dandelion seed is a little dark spot. And then I use the white pencil to, with heavy pressure, to put down where I want the actual seed, the fluffy part of the seed to go. So that should be protected when I draw over it later. Just doing more blocking in of the yellow flowers this time, and now starting on the green. And I'm just doing light layers of green and just seeing how it goes. With this background, it is going to be somewhat blurry. I'm not actually putting too much detail into the background and just adding layers of green to build up the background to the darkness that I want it. As with everything, always start lighter and go darker as you work along. Don't start dark, because sometimes you may want it to be lighter in the end and you can't make it lighter very easily with coloured pencils. And just further defining the flowers and making them darker. At this point, I'm just doing circles for the flowers. I'm not too worried about how, like, the shapes of the flowers. I just want the background to be quite blurry. Now I'm blending it out using Odourless Solvent. The one I use is Art Spectrum. I'm just using it with a filbert brush. Because I don't have very many layers down at the moment, I am using quite a fair amount on the brush. I'm still wiping it off a little bit, but it's a lot more than I use when I've got more layers on the artwork. And just continuing to do light layers with all my layers. Unless I point out that I'm using a heavy hand, my layers will always be very light layers. You don't want to smooth out the teeth of the paper by pressing hard too early, because then you can't do additional layers on top very easily. As you see, I do usually do multiple colours in the flowers. Like the purple has the blue in it as well, and it's just good to add different shades into colours. Don't always just use one colour pencil. Rarely will you find a pencil where the colour just suits it perfectly. I find multiple layers always end up looking better in the long term. It just adds more depth to the colour itself. Just adding a few highlights in with the white. Now, I will point out that this background has a huge ugly phase. You find with most artwork, they always go through an ugly phase where you just look at it and go, oh my goodness, what's going on here? It just looks terrible. And this one had it for a very long stage. I struggled with it. I got to a point where I almost threw it in the bin because the background just was not looking the way I wanted it to look. But I kept at it, and eventually I got it looking a lot better. I'm just blocking in the green above the head now. You see I'm using lots of yellows in the greens as well to make it a very warm green. If you want the green to look more cool, you add more blues in, which it depends on what effect you're going for. I wanted this to feel like a warm picture where she's in a sunlit meadow, so I wanted warm greens. I'm just lightening up some of those flowers. I was finding that they were too dark at that point. And they were contrasting too much because I don't want the focus on the flowers. I want the focus on the girl. Though at this point it is actually quite hard to judge what the flowers are looking like because most of the picture it has not been done. And with all pictures, I always find that I end up having to go back afterwards and make sure that all the values are right after the subject's drawn as well, rather than just trying to do it all at once, because you just can't judge the values right when there's this big white subject right next to it because it hasn't been coloured in. I was very careful at this point when going around the face not to go onto her skin. I didn't want her face to have the greens in it. And that's especially important when blending, because if you're not careful along the edge of the subject, you can use the brush can push the pigment onto the subject, and you don't always want that. It's okay if the subject's quite dark with lots of dark colours in it, because the darker colours cover other layers a lot easier. But if this girl's got very pale skin, so I had to be very careful not to let the pigment get pushed onto her skin. You see when I'm blending it out, I make sure to do each of the flowers first. If you just blend over the whole thing, the green will cover the flowers and it won't look right. If you want to dull some of the flowers out, that is one way to dull them, by pushing the green pigment over the top. But I wasn't after that effect. Some of the yellows I let the green sort of blend in with them, but the purples I wanted very distinct. I also had to clean the brush after doing the purples, because otherwise the pigment stays on it, and then when you go and do the yellow flowers, it would have left purple pigment on the yellow flowers. And I just cleaned that by swishing it in the Odourless Solvent, because that actually is a brush cleaner as well. And doing blur backgrounds, it's just a matter of layering and layering and blending, and then more layering until you get the effect you want. It's easy to stop too early because you don't like the way it's looking and stuff, but just got to keep going and keep trying unless the tooth of the paper is completely gone because you've pressed too hard, or you've got that many layers, then you can always add more layers. The part with the background that I struggle most with is actually not putting details in. I find blurry backgrounds quite hard to do because I always want to put all the petals in of the flowers, put all the blades of grass in, whereas you really need to have it indistinct and you want it like the shapes all blurring into each other. And I find that very hard to do. I love my detail. Just continuing doing what I've done with the other ones. You see the spots where the dandelions are, I'm just going straight over the top. Because I put the white down earlier, that area is actually protected. And when I did the white pencil for the dandelion seeds, I pressed very hard to burnish it so that that area was protected as much as possible. If you can see, now that I've blended it, there are a few little white spots. That's where the dandelion is, and that will come up better later. You'll notice that I am actually doing little strokes with the pencil rather than just keeping it flat. I am actually aiming to get a little bit of a grass texture in the background. You can see, especially with the darker greens, I am doing strokes and doing clumps of grass and clumps of the darks rather than just doing it all sort of the one color and the one shade. Now, I do apologize. I don't actually have a list of what colored pencils I used for this one, as this is a piece I did earlier this year. And I usually write down all the pencils I use, but I cannot find the list anywhere. So you just have to imagine what the colors are. I mean, the greens are, the leaf green, and then you go through to the darker ones. So the really dark green ones are blue, got a slight blue tinge to it. I think that was about 4 main greens I was using in the background. I find with backgrounds, the amount of time I actually spend on a background is far longer than what I do for the subject. And you have to make sure to spend that time on the background to get them looking good. Otherwise, if you rush through the background just to get to the subject, it just doesn't end up looking good. The background is a very important part of the whole piece. Got to make sure you do the amount of time to get it to look as good as you can. The perspective I've done with the flowers in this background is not quite accurate for a field of flowers, even though that's the look I was going for. I should have done, if I was going for a more realistic view of a field, the flowers at the back, which are at the top of the picture, should have been fainter. They should have been sort of more horizontal as well and a lot smaller. They're just about the same size as the ones at the bottom. But that I wasn't going for a completely realistic look of a field. I just wanted her to look like she was completely surrounded by flowers, and that's what I was aiming for with this. That's why the flowers at the top are quite large, and I just want them all around her. And this drawing is actually done of my daughter, so I drew how I wanted it, which is always a bonus when you're doing artwork for yourself. You don't have to follow rules that other people say you have to do. You just do it how you want it. And at the front here, at the bottom, I've done it a lot darker than I have at the top. And that's how I'm getting sort of the effect of close to far away, the close being at the bottom. Things that are closer to you always seem to be a bit darker than things which are further away. And that's to do with how the atmosphere is. And this is just a matter of continually building up the layers, using little strokes to get the look of grass. And the more layers you put in, the more and more it looks better. At a later point, I did end up going over some of those flowers in the background to cover them up a bit. I found that there was too many of them at the top. Just adding more detail into those flowers with different colours, especially with the ones closer to the front. They get a little bit more detail. And darkening up the grass even more. Definitely better not to go too dark all at once and just do it gradually. It's easy at this point to judge how dark I want to go with the grass because I've got the whole background done. However, I'm still finding at this point that having the subject all white is messing up how I'm viewing the values. I was finding at this point the background really wasn't quite looking how I wanted it, which is why at a later point I go back and do a bit more to fix it up. And here I'm just using the electric eraser to go over those dandelions. Because I put the white down first, when you use the electric eraser over the top of it, it picks it right back up to where the white was. And that's because it's just removing the colour that's sort of sitting on top of the white pencil. And then just using a luminance white pencil to further define those dandelions and add little lines in there. And now onto the hair. With hair and fur, the approach that I take is to usually put down the highlight colour down first and put a light layer of that over, and then take one of the darker colours and go over the dark shadowed spots so that you know where they are and you don't lose them. And you'll see I'm using a smaller brush to blend with now. It's still a fill, but just a smaller size. And just going over those dark shadowed spots with the darker browns, and then putting the highlights in with the light colours and the cream. And I'm just going by clumps so that I don't lose myself in the hair. I like to work in sections, especially in hair, because you can sort of lose where you are in the portrait. And with hair, I'm just drawing the clumps. I'm not focusing on individual strands. I just want to get the clumps in. And you focus on where the dark shadows are on those clumps. And just loosely blocking in with the lighter colour. Now coming through with the dark sepia and putting in the shadows. I actually find hair a lot harder to draw than just fur. Fur is a lot easier. But the main thing is just to focus on the clumps rather than individual strands. And you see how there's like clumps going across the rest of the strands, and so you put in where the shadows are for those. And now coming through with the black to darken the hair up a lot. And again, just focusing on where the clumps are, not trying to put in individual hairs at all. And you may notice, but I keep rotating the pencil in my hand as I go. That's a way to try and keep it sharper, because when you're doing hair, you do want to have quite a sharp pencil to keep the lines really fine. So if you rotate the pencil as you use it, then it keeps the point a lot sharper and you don't have to keep going back and sharpening it. Just adding in the highlights with the white luminance pencil. The good thing about the white luminance pencil is you can actually go over it with other colours so that you don't have just white on top. You've got other colours in with it. Now I'm using a very fine brush to blend so that I'm not smudging the pigment all over the place on the area where it's hanging. The fringe is coming down over her forehead. I am watching where the hair is going in the reference photo for this, but I'm not stressing too much if the clumps aren't completely right. Hair is good because you don't have to have it exactly as the reference photo. You just near enough is good enough. I'm just going over the skin in a very light layer. This one's with ivory. It's just a nice off-white. It makes a good base layer. I'm slowly going through with the flesh tones. One of the pencils I really like to use on skin is called Cinnamon. And that one works really well for pale skin. I'm just doing a light layer and building up the layers of pencil. It's starting to add a bit more to where all the shadows are. I find adding yellow in really makes the skin kind of glow later on. Like you don't notice it being yellow as such, but just adding those extra colors in to your layers just makes it the end portrait look so much better. Starting to define where all the shadows are. I find ears very hard to do. They never seem to look quite right, and when you're working on them, they're just like weird shadows and shapes. And just I focused on the reference photo and the lines that I put down previously. And the main thing is just not to think of it as an actual ear or it's supposed to look like something. Just focus on like the abstract shapes that you're drawing. As a whole, it'll look good, but when you're actually drawing it, it just looks weird. Deepening all those shadows on the face. Definitely keeping a very light hand with my drawing. I don't want to flatten the tooth of the paper by pressing too hard. As definitely for skin, it needs a lot of layers. Now I'm blending out. I am using a fair amount of solvent on the brush. Just do be careful not to use too much. I'm using more at the moment because it is just the first layer, but with additional blending later on, make sure you don't have too much on the brush, because if you use too much, it can end up moving the pigment around too much and you'll get a smudgy look. So yeah, make sure to wipe the excess off the brush before blending. Adding eyelashes in makes it look a lot better. They always I find portraits always look a little bit weird before you add in some of the details like the eyelashes. And darkening that shadow up. She's standing in sunlight, so she's actually got quite a strong light on her cheek and on her nose. I did turn it down a little bit in this drawing, but in the reference photo, she's got quite a big shadow there. At this point, I found that I wanted to add a little bit more pink into her skin, as she was starting to look little bit more too pale. Like she didn't have the warmth in the skin that I was looking for. I don't add much, just a little bit to add the hint of that pink in there. I just keep layering those colours on again just to build up those layers. And here I'm using a lot less on the brush when I blend. No, except for that last little bit, that was quite a bit there in the hair. But luckily it didn't smudge. I'm trying to get the ear to look right. Ears, the worst part of any portrait, I find. I'm just adding some more of the pinks into the skin where the shadows are. At this point, the expression on her face looks a little strange because she's actually taking a breath to blow the dandelion. It's a sort of an odd look to try and draw. Yeah, so definitely used less on my brush that time. And using the ivory to add some more highlights in. The ivory works really well to lighten it. It's not white, it's an off-white, so it has a really nice colour. But it's not as yellowy as the cream, so it works well. Now I'm just adding in an extra shadow there because she's actually got light coming from behind her as well. So there's a little bit of a shadow of her ear, from her ear on her face. You'll notice I'm using a piece of tracing paper under my hand, and that's to prevent me from smudging the grass, the green, all over the picture. Otherwise I'd have to go around and erase that all the time. And with children portraits, make sure you don't go too dark on the eyebrows, as they really often they don't have a very defined eyebrow. My daughter, she's got a bit of a brown one, but it's not as thick as an adult's eyebrow would be. I've done other portraits where there's been no eyebrow at all because the child was blonde, and that makes for a difficult portrait because it's hard to define that part of the eye without the eyebrow there. You just got to use the shadows to make that area stand out. when I'm blending with the brush, I'm actually going in slight small circles, and that's to try and keep the pigment smooth and to not get lines in on the pigment. Sometimes when you do strokes with the brush, when you're blending, it actually makes lines, and that can be useful when you're doing things like fur and hair, but in skin you want it to look smooth, so make sure to do little tiny circles. And now just onto the neck and continuing on. I do actually end up taking a photo of this, of the face, and putting it on my computer to compare to the reference photo and putting one on top of the other so that I can see where the differences are. There was a slight difference in the mouth and the eyes that was making it difficult for me because it wasn't looking quite right, and it was a little bit frustrating. So I ended up having to do that to help figure out where the problem was with my portrait. Yeah, it's good to do with portraits, especially human ones. You want to get it as close to the portrait as possible. So taking a photo and putting it onto the computer and comparing to the reference photo side by side, or one on top of the other, is a good way of working out where the differences are. Sometimes it's just a matter of having the shadow of the cheeks slightly too high or slightly too low. Simple thing like that can change the muscle structure on the face. Sometimes the hardest part at this point is remembering which order I did all the pencils in. And trying to get the skin to match the face. But you're looking at it and it's like, oh, it looks so different. But you just got to remember once you've done all your layers, it will look the same. You just got to trust that you get it there. Areas like the neck are a bit easier to do as well because you don't have to focus quite as much on getting everything in exactly the right spot. You want all the little creases and stuff to be roughly right, but it's not quite the same as the face where you need to have the shape of the nose right, the way the lips are, the shape of the eyes and the eyebrows. You've got to get those details are very important to get right. Now onto the dress. She's wearing a red and white striped dress. So this dress was a bit time consuming to do. I'm not too keen on doing another striped dress in a while. And is I had to make sure that the red pencil was kept very sharp. So I'm rotating it a lot to keep the point sharp, and I'll have to keep it sharp by also sharpening it a lot just so that it doesn't, because when it's blunt, it'll end up being thicker lines, and this dress, because it's got such thin red lines, you got to be careful to make sure that it stays sharp to get those thin lines in. Now this section is the little ruffles over the arms, and it was a bit confusing watching the reference photo as to where these ruffles were going and what was what. It's just a matter of watching where the reference photo is, what you're doing, and when you do the line drawing, make sure you get as much detail in as you can for things like the stripes. You still have to look at the reference photo because you have to figure out which ones are white and which ones are red. At this point, I'm really not worried about shading or anything like that. I'm just trying to block in where the red lines are. So once I've got that in, then I can focus on where the shadows are and where the lights are. With those spots at the bottom, I actually ended up changing them from the reference photo a bit. The reference photo had a cut in the dress, a seam going down underneath the arm, and so the stripes didn't line up exactly, and the spots were like half spots and things like that. So I ended up just making the line straight and making the spots fully full circles rather than the half circles, and just made it look a bit nicer. Oops, working off the video window there. Only a few spots. Didn't miss much. And just going through with a more orangey red to warm up those red lines a little bit, make them a bit of a nicer colour. And here you'll see I'm using my really tiny filbert brush to blend with. I find when you've got a paintbrush that you're blending with, occasionally like the bristles will just start standing out and they get a little bit damaged by the odorless solvent. And I don't worry about it with my bigger brush, but with this really tiny one, I just use a pair of scissors and trim them off, because this one I do want it to be, I want the brush to be quite a neat brush tip. I don't want bristles going everywhere because they may affect how I blend. This is the one I use for all the fine detail. You'll notice the stripes on her chest are not just straight. There's wrinkles in the dress itself, which makes the stripes go a little bit wonky. And it's important to get little details like that right in things like clothes, because if you don't get the wrinkles in, the clothes just won't look natural. Now I'm just using a violet grey luminance pencil to add in some of the shadows. Even though she's in a white dress, a white and red dress, the white itself doesn't stay very white because of all the shadows makes the stripes go grey. And this part here was quite complicated, getting all those little tiny little ruffles in. Just focusing, keeping an eye on the reference photo to see where the little ruffles are. At the same time, if you don't get the ruffles exactly like the reference photo, at the end of the day, it's not going to matter because you've got the effect of the ruffles. It doesn't need to be exactly right. Getting that shadow that goes under the arm in. Off the page again. Whoops. And now with the black, making those, so getting the really dark shadows in, which you can't get with the grey. So not too much, just a little bit of the black. You don't want to go overboard with it. I found the dress was quite time consuming to do because I'm having to blend with a very fine brush. It did get quite time consuming. You had to be careful not to smudge the red over the white, and that was the reason why I had to use such a small brush, because you wanted the white to be in distinct stripes, so you didn't want the red being blended over the top of it. And the addition of those shadows on the dress definitely make it look a lot more like a real dress rather than just a drawing. It adds that three dimension to it. Adding some highlights in with the white luminance pencil. And now onto the arm, and I'll follow a similar pattern to what I've done with the skin so far. Just putting down the same light layers, starting with the ivory, and then going over with the flesh colours. The good reason of putting ivory down over the whole area is that it adds a layer of pigment onto the paper even without adding much colour, so it actually makes it easier to blend future layers having that layer of ivory down. And these are all very light layers, keeping my hand and the pressure very light. As you can see by how far I'm holding the pencil back, keeping it very light. I'm just starting to deepen those shadows, making sure I know where all the shadows are. Sometimes you can lose where your lines are when you add too many layers before you start defining where those shadows and lines are. As you see, my method's pretty standard. I'm just doing the light layers and then I gradually darken up as I go. Yeah, I just deepen that shadow even further, making sure I get those little creases around the elbow in, and the dimple on the back of the elbow. At this age, kids have some quite distinct wrinkles in their arms, So it's important to get those wrinkles in, even if sometimes you might think that they're too too big, but yeah, they have them. Well, certainly my daughter did. With hands, I find it is important to keep a close eye on your reference photo to see how the fingers are going. I find fingers and wrists are another area that I find difficult to do sometimes, and just a matter of making sure that you are paying attention to where all the shadows are on the reference photo. I'm going through with the dark sepia and darkening it up further. And now that I've got all those layers down, it's time to blend it out. Now, I always find that even though I've put all those layers down, once you blend it, you definitely can tell that you need to add more layers. And you just got to keep layering. The more you do, the better it'll look. You can see I'm doing little circles with the brush when I'm blending. I'm trying to keep that skin looking smooth. Making sure those shadows are dark enough. Got to keep adding a little bit more dark to it and see how it goes, and then if it needs more, keep adding more. At this point, it's much easier to judge how dark you need to go because you've got most of the picture done. You can see how it looks compared to the rest of the picture. Just adding another layer with this color. to deepen the colours a bit more. Sometimes when you blend it, it sort of fades out some of the colours. Some colours it makes it more vibrant, and other colours it tends to fade them a bit. And these ones are getting a little bit faded by the blending. And then onto the dandelion. That was pretty quick to do after everything else. I'm just adding in the different colours and getting those shades right on the dandelion head. Unfortunately, I don't have the video footage showing how I did the whole of the dandelion there. But I just used a white luminance pencil and went over it, making that white more more defined and covering up the green around it. And there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Catch you next time.